I'll
And
let you just get started because I know you've got stuff from Florida.
oh yeah. Well, you actually brought up with the whole casino mafia gambling something interesting. We talked about using machines or electronics to manipulate results. As you said, you had potential card shuffling machines that were rigging, shuffling and rigging the deck a little bit. People being potentially blackmailed to help do it or cover it up. And I find all of those things very interesting because it further highlights, can we trust electronics and systems to not only count our cards but count our elections, and how do we verify? So you've had me on a few times. I think in the past we've talked about some of our findings in Nevada and Pennsylvania. Now we've brought to you some recent preliminary analysis for Florida. We've also actually recently released some concerns for Minnesota, which was won by Harris, but we're still finding some interesting things there. But I did want to highlight, like I always do, and you bring it up, is what the ETA is doing is what I am doing. I'm one of the executive directors of the Election Truth Alliance. My background's in cybersecurity information systems, both civilian and military. And is this election denial? Are we questioning the outcome of elections? And does bringing up the concerns and the facts right now, does that stop people from voting in the midterms? So I did want to address that. And I wanted to say a few things. Well, one, as we always like to say, there is never harm in doing audits and double checking. As we said, we audit, our finances, our banks, we audit, engineering, production to make sure things are quality tested. There should never be harm in a second look, a second opinion, a second check. And if people don't want that, questions are like, democracy is the most important thing, in my opinion. Counting the votes and making sure the votes are counted correctly is that's a cornerstone of American democracy. And I don't think anyone should push back against the harm in making sure that our votes are counted correctly the first time around. And, we address any problems as they come up. So,
well, I should also say that perhaps with the most consequential election in American history, it's fair to ask a question or two, and at least, as you say, just to do a general audit. I mean, before anybody's throwing any accusations anywhere, it's simply an audit. Give us access to the information, and we move on. So that's one of the things I like, as I was saying, kind of in preparation for you coming on. I just like the dispassionate way, the unemotional, statistically underpinned way in which you reach your conclusions. So go ahead.
Yeah, and two flags as well when it comes to audits is we do in the U.S., depending on states, there are some types of audits before or after the elections. And what the ETA has started bringing up as we investigate the statistical concerns, but also those audit reports, we are worried that those audits may not be sufficient in catching some of the things we're flagging now. And that's why we want these second audits. We pretty much want to go to the counties and the precincts that look strange, and we want to focus on those. We want, hand count investigations there. We want that second independent audit. And I'll jump right into the concerns. And I've tried to make this PowerPoint. I know when you first brought me on, we could sit here for 30 minutes to an hour talking slides. I've tried to make this pretty short and pretty simple for you. So please, at any point, ask questions or jump in. But let's see if we can bring up the Florida PowerPoint here. I may have to have you guys throw it up on the screen. There it is. Here's Florida. Pretty simple. So as I said, Election Truth Alliance, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, founded in December. We've been investigating not only the 24 election, but any special or intermediary elections since then. And we've been publishing our findings. And actually, recently, we started talking about this. Not only have we been using statistics to determine if there's any red flags, but we've been on the ground in some of these swing states and some of these non-swing states investigating the counties that are coming up as anomalous. And we will continue to make some of those on-the-ground findings public as we go forward. We're just now starting to talk about and release some of the on-the-ground findings in Florida. And by the end of this week, we'll have even more, and then we'll actually get into some of the legal things. And I'll touch base just at the end about some of the legal implications for those on-the-ground investigations. I do want to flag statistical analysis of elections is not proof of election fraud. It is at best evidence, but it tells you where to look. And if you start to find a bunch of red flags, it warrants investigation. Okay, so to keep things very simple, you've seen some of our charts before. We've done heat maps. We've done other types of things. This is a scatter plot. You may have seen this on our some of our reports. If not, we have reports at electiontruthealliance.org. We've done 3 different swing states. We've done a handful of non-swing states. And one of the most common formats we use is a scatter plot. And this is just precinct voting results across a county or multiple counties. And the reason I bring this up is we are, based on the experts and peer-reviewed work of election fraud detectors that have looked at Russian elections in Europe, and even some experts in the U.S., they flagged that a normal election should look a bit more like what we're going to show you. Should have a normal distribution. It should be, when we do it at a scatter plot and we do, the amount of votes you're getting or the vote share you're getting versus the turnout across precincts, it should be more of a straight line. And that's what we're going to actually show and show some of what Florida looks like in comparison. But the reason I bring this up is if you look at the graph on the right, we have labeled here a normal election pattern. This is a scatter plot of this is, a generated one. So this would be every precinct in the county. The x-axis is turnout. That just means I got 100 registered voters, 50 show up to vote during the election.
Did we lose him? Or have you lost me?
Nathan,
There we go.
are you there?
Okay.
Hello. You guys
there you
good?
go.
Am I here?
Yeah, the x-axis you were saying. Go ahead.
So any questions so far on
No, but you were
what we're
saying.
looking
I'm
at?
sorry, I missed you. So you were saying 100 turnout. You were just explaining. The
Yeah.
x-axis is simple. Let's say
So-
100. Yeah, go ahead.
No worries, no worries. So the x-axis is turnout. And since these are precincts and every dot is a precinct, for example, if you've got 100 registered voters and 50 of them vote, that's 50% turnout. They'd be, somewhere at the 50% line. That's how you read these graphs. And then it's just the percentage of the votes. So if you get 50% of the votes, you're going to be at the 50% on the y-axis, above or below that. So nonetheless, the reason why we highlight it this way is this is a good method to show if there's any abnormal voting patterns. And on the right, we have an example of what we argue based on the work of these election experts abnormal could look like. For example, there should be no relationship between how many people show up to vote and how much of the vote a candidate is getting across multiple precincts. It should be, as I said, generally what you'll see is both candidates are going to sit at a average vote share at low turnout, medium turnout, and high turnout. If you see this effect, which is on the right, which means we're seeing that for this candidate, that as turnout increased across these precincts or precincts of higher turnout, more voters showed up or more votes were cast, either or, one candidate begins to disproportionately benefit. That is a red flag for potential vote manipulation. In this case, it could be vote stuffing, either physical or digital. And this is what's been observed and reported in Russian elections multiple times, multiple elections by election experts such as Roman Yudat, Sergei Shpilkin. So as we said, we know what normal should look like and we know what abnormal should look like. Now I'm going to actually show you what we put out recently for 3 counties in Florida. And here that is. This is the first county. This is the most populated county, the more liberal county. This is Miami-Dade. And this is all of the votes, all the vote types for the county. And pretty much what we're showing here is this is the same type of graph. This is a scatter plot. What we see is that across all the precincts in the county, as more votes were cast or more voters turned up to vote, the Republican presidential candidate began to proportionally get more votes across the board. And as we said, this type of effect has been flagged for potential ballot stuffing in Russian elections. And we see the inverse, of course, for the Democratic president. They go down. So this is one way to visualize it. Now I'm going to actually show you a much easier to visualize way, and we can actually start talking about some of the implications.
Before you do that, let me just ask you a
Yes.
question. Why couldn't it be that as voter turnout increases, that just more people come out who are Trump voters?
Yes, we get that question a lot. So here's the problem with this effect, and we'll actually show it even more precisely in a second graph. The problem we're finding is that, as we said before, per the work of experts, there should be no relationship between the amount of people showing up to vote across all these precincts and the amount of votes you're getting. In other examples, such as we'll show you for mail-in, what we actually see is that both candidates are somewhat consistent across all voter turnout. So precincts of low turnout, precincts of high turnout, the average amount of votes they're getting across all of those precincts in those percentages is somewhat consistent.
Okay.
And so in order to create this effect normally, well, it would be arguably impossible to create this effect normally by voters being engaged, because in order for you to get specific precincts that, as more people turn out to vote, more votes are just for one candidate. There's no way for voters to know the amount of turnout in their precinct during the election. They can't, you can't really engage certain groups of people to do this well. And that's where we're flagging almost algorithmic or some type of systematic manipulation, because it's too persistent. It's too consistent across all of these different ranges of turnout. And we're actually going to show it to you here again. Okay. And these are the other two counties. We're seeing the same effects. This is Palm Beach and St. Lucie. I believe Palm Beach was still won by Harris, but we still see this effect in that county, and then St. Lucie as well. Now, one thing I didn't really touch on too much, but as we said, with concerns about machines and counting and how you could potentially manipulate them, these three counties specifically, two of them use ES&S, which is a major voting system used all across the U.S., and the other is Dominion system, which is the second top one. We can talk a little bit more about that at the end. There's been some changes to Dominion recently. Okay, now I'm going to show you what I personally like, and these are the same data set. We've just put them in bins. So now, instead of you just looking at a bunch of dots on a graph and lines, we've put them in percentages. And these are the same data. On the left is a binning graph, same turnout on the x-axis, same vote share on the y-axis, but we've just put them all in bins by 10%. And then on the right, we've done the same technique, but instead of it being by set 10%, we said, let's put them in weighted bins. So you've got, for example, 200, and a little bit more than 200,000 votes per bin. And that takes out a lot of the noise. Now, explain to me what effect we're seeing on the left here. What do you think this looks like?
It looks like, at least from a turnout standpoint, you've got a very good turnout for Kamala Harris that exceeds that of the Trump turnout. If I'm seeing this properly, I got to blow this up.
Yes. So what we're seeing, to kind of put it in words, I know you've got some listeners. We have a graph here with multiple bins ranging on the left from 30% turnout all the way up to around 90%. And it's in sets of 10. And what we're seeing is that below 60, 70% turnout, Harris has a majority of votes across these precincts. So all of the precincts below 60, 70% turnout, Harris has a majority of the votes. Above that 60, 70% turnout, we see a flip. And Trump begins to then dominate those higher turnout locations from I think it's somewhere around 65, 67% to 70 to 80%.
I mean, you really see that
on
on the right-hand side of the graph. You really see it dramatically.
Yes, and then, so on the right-hand side, what we've done, as I said, is we've weighted these so that, for example, on the left, you have some turnout percentages that don't have a huge amount of precincts, and it's going to create a lot of noise or inconsistency. On the right, this is another technique of visualizing any changes. They're weighted so that we have an equal amount of votes across all of these bins, and we get to see any major changes clearly. And what we see is it's the same effect. The x-axis is just shifted a little bit, 0 to 66%. We're seeing Harris is getting a good amount of the votes. Above that point, that is when Trump begins to overtake Harris and begins to win across all of those higher turnout precincts. Now, the reason this is a concern is, as we said, and as we'll show you with mail-in, we have yet to determine a reasonable way that voters could do this, because there is not a way for a voter to know what their turnout engagement is going to be, nor is there really a way to mobilize voters so that only at 66% and higher precincts of turnout does all the Republicans show up. It doesn't. If you're going to mobilize your voter base, they're going to show up across all turnout percentages, and you're going to have more votes. All right. Any questions on this?
No, but it still lingers the point that I think I could make, which is, I get it. So more voters turned out, and those were Trump voters. Maybe they were voters who had never voted before. Maybe they were animated by some anger at Biden or whatever it was. But as we point to more and more of the voter turnout reflecting votes for Trump, couldn't it be that just Trump voters turned out in big numbers?
Yeah. I mean, theoretically, it could be.
But you're saying,
The
but let me.
Yeah,
So I don't mean to answer my own question, but I'm kind of just trying to summarize and make sure I understand your point. But your point is, sure, Mark, that is possible, but it would defy the normal kinds of mix of voting that you would find. I mean, you just wouldn't find in a normal voting pattern the kind of surge for one candidate that we saw. Is that essentially the point?
yeah, it's pretty much, to put it in layman's terms, theoretically, you could do this. But to do this consistently across multiple counties, where all of those counties you see the same effects of 60% turnout and higher going to one candidate, it begins to lean into the level of non-human voting behavior.
Okay.
And as I
Okay.
said, once you start seeing that consistency across multiple different counties, different voters, it just becomes a little too much. It's a red flag, and that's why
Sure.
we want these investigations, and really we want answers. And as I said, this is all of the vote types, by the way. So what we do have for you next is we do have mail-in voting, and and as I said as well, oh, well, we'll come back to that. I don't want to get to that just yet. All right,
Okay.
mail-in voting. Oh, don't get ahead of me.
Okay.
So mail-in voting, right? So as we said, why is it? And this is where you can have good pushback. Well, we brought this up for Pennsylvania. We brought this up for Nevada. We started seeing, the same concerns in North Carolina. Why is it that mail-in voting looks statistically like what we would expect and what has been held up as a more normal human voting behavior by election experts? So why is it that mail-in exhibits the effect that we argue is more normal, where both candidates have a somewhat consistent amount of the votes across all turnout? And that's what we see here, right? You see that Harris, from low turnout of 0% and above precincts, so 0 to 15 and all the way up to around 35, because mail-in is at most 35% of some of these precincts, we see that across all of these precincts, Harris is getting closer to that 55 to 60% of the vote, and Trump that inverse in the remaining amount. And we don't see a huge and consistent change for any precinct thresholds or levels. And as I said, this is what we would expect to see. So why is it that mail-in looks like this, but election day and early voting, depending on what types of voting they have? So in Pennsylvania, election day; North Carolina, early voting and election day. Why are we seeing the opposite effects? And we're seeing it almost a effect of a certain turnout threshold and above begins to benefit one candidate. And that's where we're flagging this needs to be investigated. We need to go to these places that are exhibiting these effects, and we need to actually hand count and audit and make sure that this isn't this, as I said, this could be some, unique, very interesting effects, but it's too consistent and it flags for the same type of vote manipulation being seen in Russian elections. And I think, as I quoted before, they were actually seeing in 2011 Russian elections where turnout of, I think, 80 to 90% does the flip. So that's where the pro-Russian or pro-Russian government party begins to get a huge amount of the votes, is 80 to 90%, and it jumps up. Okay. Any questions here? Any thoughts on, mail in? And
No, it's fascinating. The mail-in really is telling, isn't it? Now, again, you could say, well, Democrats use the mail-in more than typical GOP voters, and that's the reason that Kamala Harris had such a good showing in the mail-in part of the tabulation. I suppose that I'm trying to think of pushback, potential pushback.
yeah,
But again,
as I said,
you
we
would
just
still
kind of
say
point
that
to,
you would still say though that the dispersal of votes, the way in which they're distributed, would have a more natural kind of view in-person voting than and in some way reflect what was happening with the mail-in.
we would expect to see, I mean, even if, if a candidate is really popular, for election day, we would expect to just see this effect, just whatever candidate is more popular, getting more of the votes. We wouldn't expect to see any change at a set turnout. Now,
sure,
here's
exactly. That's the reason the
clincher for
mail.
you.
But just to be, I just want to put underscore it for myself. Maybe the reason the mail-in's important and instructive is because it shows you the votes were there for Kamala Harris in Florida. So as you look at that turnout surge and it's all going for Trump, you think to yourself, well, wait a minute. I mean, how can the mail-in be so reflective of one thing and yet the in-person reflective of another? So it again, as you say, it feels red flaggy.
Yeah. And I mean, for a lot of these places, you're dividing votes across three different types of voting. And one thing we do want to flag is mail-in seems to have a little more strict security and process, right? You've got, I know North Carolina alone, you have to have either witnesses or a notary when you send your mail-in vote. You have to pre-register. They have to send the ballot to you and get it back. So there's a bit more of a verification process. Election day early voting, you're just going in person and you're voting on the system there. And so I'm going to show you this. I know we're running a little low on time, but here's the thing I wanted to show you. And as we talked about before, so on the left is those 3 counties we talked about summed up for Florida. On the right is Pennsylvania, all of the precincts across all of the counties. And remember what we talked about. It's concerning that you would see the same effect across multiple locations, multiple demographics. And we're seeing the same effects in Pennsylvania, where precincts of lower than 65, 72%, it's a little higher of a threshold for turnout, but we see that effect as well, right? 0 to 65%, Harris is getting majority of the votes. After 65 to 72%, we see that close, and then Trump begins to take over from 72% and higher turnout across all of these precincts, and his average vote share is sitting closer to that 60%. And it's the same effect we're seeing in Florida. It's the same effect we're seeing in North Carolina and some concerns. And really, it brings up the question of why would you see the same effect consistently across multiple counties and multiple states when they are different regionally speaking, but they all use the same voting systems. And so that's why, as we said, we're going to keep releasing these types of investigations, but we have now, as we said, we've started doing on the ground investigations. We're going to these places where we're seeing these effects. We're looking at the systems and the voter registration databases that are used here. And we will continue to make public the problems we are starting to find. And the last little piece I'll throw at you then is everyone says, well, as we brought up and we've said time and time again, and people don't seem to be, fully aware of kind of how our voting system works in our elections. 70 to 80% of the votes as of 24 are hand-marked paper ballots. We use hand-marked paper ballots all across the U.S. We don't use a lot of the voting machines. Those are smaller. Now, what's interesting is even those hand-marked paper ballots are not hand-counted. They are machine-counted. They are counted by an optical scanner. Almost 100% of the votes are. And so we bring up that concern because we're saying even though people hand mark their votes and cast them, they are still counted by machines.
Sure. It's not the voting, it's the counting.
It's the counting. It's not who votes that counts. It's who counts the votes. Exactly. And so, as I said, we're not making any accusations against these companies. We're just flagging that they do these top 3 systems, the S&S, Dominion, and Hart Civic. They span a majority of the swing states, the non-swing states. And if a malicious third-party actor could compromise these systems, these are a common link across all of the places we've started to find these statistical red flags and anomalies. So
I want to, because you mentioned these systems, let's spend a second on what's just happened with Dominion voting systems, okay, Nathan? Because I mentioned, we covered it on the show the other day, but it bears mentioning as an adjunct to what you've been talking about.
Yeah, so Dominion, one of the second largest voting system in the U.S. I know they span a few different states. I know they span Nevada pretty aggressively. They have both tabulation machines that do optical scanning at like the precinct level, and then they have voting machines where you go and you cast your vote.
I think they're in 27 states is what I recall, but maybe you have.
And they do have, some of the counties will be like, predominantly ES and S state, but then there'll be some Dominion counties. They're pretty mixed in. And yes, they were recently purchased by another entity and relabeled as Liberty Voting, I believe. So what are your concerns about that? I can't talk too much about the implications. But
well, my concern, I can say this. I mean, you're the dispassionate, unemotional statistician, but I can just tell you, I'm the wildly emotional, panicked guy who is looking at a company and a technology that's been purchased by someone who is a very strong GOP advocate and ally of Donald Trump. And so one worries that these systems that are used are not impartial any longer. They are owned by entities and people with a clear political agenda. And that's my concern.
So I will say 2 things. First and foremost, the ETA has brought up multiple times the concerns of should the companies that own our voting systems be connected or partisan in nature at all, right? Should they not be nonpartisan? Should they be, using open source systems? So right now, most people aren't aware, our voting systems are proprietary. They're owned by the companies. They're audited by a select few groups. And outside of that, there's not a lot known about how these systems work or run until you really are able to get in and access them. I will highlight, as the ETA has been investigating these systems more, there are some concerns coming up with the 24 election where one of the companies that audits Dominion, Hard Intercivic, NES, or at least ESNS and Dominion that get audited specifically by this company, that's ProVNV. There were software updates that do raise some red flags. And I think multiple entities have reported on this. I know Smart Elections have reported on this. I know Newsweek has talked about this. But these software updates, from our understanding so far, may have made changes to some of these systems that may have weakened some of the security practices, such as flagging or alarming if there's any changes to the source code. And so these systems were updated software-wise. It was de minimis, meaning you didn't recertify the machines. You didn't have to check them again. And I think that update came out just before November. And it's things like this that we say, we definitely believe that there should be a second look at how these systems are ran, who runs them. And at the end of the day, I think the final piece that I really like to bring up a lot is we've had examples of a malicious compromise of hardware and software before. We had Volkswagen in 2015 with Dieselgate, right? Where they got caught because they were cheating emissions testing. They were being audited and passing their audits, but the data was not adding up. There was too high emissions for what was being reported. So what did you do? You went and you said, well, let's test the systems in use, or let's test the end result, which for us is going to be looking at the physical ballots that people cast. For Dieselgate was driving the vehicle on the highway and testing the emissions then. So these are just things we bring up. And at the end of the day, we want people to be confident our elections are free and fair and safe and secure. We want to improve our election practices. And we want to make sure that if there is a compromise, we need to investigate it now so that it can be handled and made public before the midterms, when I feel like a lot of Americans are going to be engaged and are going to vote. And the implications for the midterms and the next presidential election are very large.
Sure. Of course, that's true. Quickly, George Hunt with a $5 super chat says, no one to blame but the people, the stolen election machines that voted for him. Now everyone is afraid to stand up to him, just as we knew it would be. Yeah, well, that may be. The Dominion voting machine sold to the Republican donor. Yeah, we covered that. So they've collected a lot of data, says Randy. What impact is all of this going to have for the 2026 or 2028 elections? Anything?
Yeah. So I'll say this. As I said, we're limited in what we can say right now. My lawyer's, I'm very tight-lipped. But I will say this. The ETA is not only publishing these findings and having these conversations, but here in the near future, we're going to make public our on-the-ground investigations and the legal actions that will be coming from them. Some of the problems we're finding is we're finding evidence of a potential compromise of some of the voter registration databases used across some of these states that are very impactful. We're also, as we said, concerned about the systems in the machines. We found mismatching reports from, the counties themselves and their data, and some other things as well. So I would say this as we go forward, right? It's mostly about, as the ETA makes more of this public, really what we need the states to start doing these investigations as well. We need governors and the secretaries of states to get on board, to come to the table. We need them to start looking at their systems, because once we make public some of our findings, the implication isn't just in the place that we're having these problems. It could be anywhere and everywhere these systems were used.
And we have a state-centric election system, obviously, so that's why you need the states to get involved. Randy also asking, is Mark suggesting that Harris could have won Florida? I don't know. We didn't come to that conclusion here. I just was...
As of right now, the ETA hasn't made any public statements there. Yeah. As I said, though, we are investigating the rest of the counties in Florida, and we will have some estimates as we go forward. I will flag that it is very interesting this effect is happening, and it does bring up concerns that if some of the bluest counties in Florida were impacted, and it is vote manipulation, those counties could have their results changed, and we'll see what the full scale will look like as we go forward. I will flag one other thing is we've been investigating not only the presidential election, but some of these down ballot races as well that have raised red flags. So some of these Senate races, some of these House races, and we will be making those findings public as we go forward as well. And then we can have those conversations.
On data distribution, we get this, Nathan. CC Ryder says, show me a graph for the last 10 general elections compared to 2024 for an accurate sample set. When you show which you did, the disbursement, the heat map, and various things that you've shown as to a normal dispersal of votes and an abnormal dispersal of votes, et cetera, are you comfortable with, and can you address her concern about the idea that the sample size has to be significant so that the statistics are significant as well?
Yeah, this comes up a lot. I've heard a few people, bring up the law of large numbers. We're actually working on kind of a public statement and address about that. We've got, some PhD statisticians that are, batting around the language and how to talk about it. But I will say this, I would say that the ETA is very confident that the data sets we have for using all of the precincts in a county is pretty sufficient in getting a good picture of, some of the trends in voting behaviors. And, you actually see, and what we've shown a few times is we see high variation at lower turnout because you have less votes. But we're still seeing what we argue is, a concerning effect, even in places where there isn't a huge amount of votes. We're going to places that have the most amount of votes per precincts, and we're finding this effect there. So there is no bigger data set than some of the most populated counties in the state. So we're pretty confident, as we said, that these are some alarming concerns. We make this public, right? We make our reports public. The data is public. We also put this data up on our dashboards after we verify it so that you guys can go and you can look at it yourselves and you can peer review it and raise any flags if you think there's inaccuracy there. But as I said, we've done this analysis to multiple swing states and multiple non-swing states, and we're finding this effect pretty consistently in places that are alarming, and we're not seeing this effect as much in mail-in. And we have looked at past elections for both the 2020 election. We even have data sets going back to 2016, a little earlier. We do plan on making a bit more of that public as we go, and we can have those conversations as well as how does that change and how does it compare?
At minimum, it's provocative and perhaps it's insanely alarming. Election Truth Alliance, you can find them. You can knock around on the website, nonprofit, nonpartisan. And Nathan, you always bring it. You bring the receipts. People can believe them. People can question them. People can talk about the data set. They can talk about the sample size, but you do bring it and you lay it out so beautifully. And I really appreciate you spending time with us always. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. As I said, we'll have some more stuff coming out here in the near future. I'd love to talk through that when we get to that point.
Love for you to come
the
back.
last piece.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we'll have a link to Election Truth Alliance under this video. Go ahead.
It'll be big, and I feel like the last thing we start bringing up and we keep talking about now that I think people understand is it's like democracy is not going to defend itself, right? Like we got to be engaged, we got to ask questions, and I really think at the end of the day, as we make more of this public, it is worth our time to make sure our elections are free, fair, safe, and secure as we go forward. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, bravo. Here. Thanks. Election Truth Alliance. See you again, Nathan. Nathan Taylor. Salam, my friend. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.